Amanda from Pontes Books, here with the Chapter 20 Historical Tidbit from The Prince and the Pauper. Today's historical tidbit is a smallish mention in Chapter 20, but becomes very, very important to the plot of this chapter and the one that comes after it. So today's historical tidbit that we are exploring is called the Dissolution of the Monasteries, which is a little wordier than I like to do my titles typically, because I like them to be things that are understandable and relatable. However, this is a very specific phrase that relates to the history of this chapter, so I went with the original phrase. So we're going to break it down after we look at the example here, of course. So here's our reference in The Prince and the Pauper. So we have this scene where Edward shows up, he meets this hermit in the middle of the woods, and the hermit's telling him all about himself and his life. So one of the revelations he makes is that he is an archangel. So that's where this comes from. This is the hermit saying this to Edward. Yes, I am an archangel, a mere archangel. I, that might have been Pope. It is verily true. I was told it from heaven in a dream 20 years ago. Ah, yes, I was to be Pope, and I should have been Pope, for heaven had said it. But the king dissolved my religious house, and I, poor, obscure, unfriended monk, was cast homeless upon the world, robbed of my mighty destiny. So here we see Edward finding out, kind of two things about this hermit. One, that he claims to be an archangel, which we'll get to in one of our future vocabulary words, I think for chapter 21. And then the other thing he finds out is that he used to be a monk, and he doesn't say this, but it's kind of implied, in the Catholic Church. And then when King Henry VIII, Edward's father, switched everything over to the Church of England during the Reformation, he was kicked out of his religious house. He was a monk, so a monastery, and then was left homeless without being able to become Pope, because he claimed that he had heard in a dream that he would one day have become the Pope, which is a position in the Catholic Church. So let's take a look at the history of what's being referenced here. So I wanted to, like I said before, break down these words first so that this phrase makes a little bit more sense. So dissolution just means the conclusion or end of something. And a monastery is a building that's occupied by religious monks. So in this case, monk can be a member of various religious communities. Usually it's a group of men, but it is, in this case, talking about Catholic monks, because those were the monasteries that Henry VIII shut down. So in actual history, this all began, technically before 1536, but when Henry VIII wanted to divorce from his first wife, he asked for a divorce from the Pope in the Catholic Church and was denied. And then this all spiraled because of that. So in 1536, which is during the Reformation period in Tudor England, Henry was the supreme head of the Church of England, and he enacted what was called the Act of Suppression. So that was what happened in 1536. So that's why that's the technical start of this whole process. And in that act, it allowed him to basically shut down small monasteries that had an income of less than 200 pounds a year. So they were shut down, and then their land, their buildings, everything that went with them actually went back to Henry, went back to the crown, went back to, the royal family. So that's how it kind of all started, but that wasn't the end of it. He wanted all of the monasteries to be shut down. So then there was the Second Suppression Act in 1539, which allowed the dissolution of larger monasteries. So even those weren't safe. And then that land from, both of these acts were sold to family. They went to the crown, and then Henry would sell some of them back to families who supported him and the Church of England. But as a result, it left thousands of monks homeless and unemployed, which is what we see happening to our hermit in this story. So this particular part of the story, although not true to history exactly, because as far as I know, we don't have a specific record of a particular monk who was very upset by this and decided to take it out on Henry's son. That part's fiction. But the situation that he was in was very common. It's very likely that there would have been many people feeling that same way. So then just one last point, just something that was added in one of the articles I read, a little fun fact, is that oftentimes, or some say that the nursery rhyme, Little Jack Horner, is tied to the dissolution of the monasteries. So the nursery rhyme goes, Little Jack Horner sat in a corner eating a Christmas pie. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, "What a good boy am I." So if you're not familiar with that, that's the nursery rhyme. So the way the story goes, if this is connected, there was actually someone named Thomas Horner, so not Jack Horner, Thomas Horner, and he worked for an abbey, one of the last remaining large abbeys, and he was in England, and he was sent to London carrying a large Christmas pie that was basically full of, I guess, deeds, I guess you could say, for these large manors that were all around London. And I'm not exactly sure why he would be traveling with all these inside of a Christmas pie, but I don't know, that's the way it goes. So supposedly then, along on his journey to London, he stopped and he opened the pie and pulled out one of the manors, or I don't know, multiple of them. He basically pulled out the contents, and one that he pulled out was a particular manor that this guy, Thomas Horner, did actually end up living at. And some of the properties of these, like the manors, contained like I think it was like a lead mine. And in Latin, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, plumbum, so like plumbum means lead. So supposedly when he's putting in his thumb and pulling out a plum, that was kind of like a play on words from the Latin for lead, because then this manor that he ended up living on, was connected to lead. So I don't know, might be a stretch, but nursery rhymes are, the more you dig into them, they're weird, and they are never tied to, fun little happy things. There's always like this deeper, darker meaning to them. So that's the way that the story went here. So that's the dissolution of the monasteries. Hopefully you learned something. Have a good rest of your day.